I'm David Fode, editor of Public Sector Catering magazine, and thank you for joining us for the second in our series, The Future of Your Food Service webinars. Today we're going to be taking a look at hospital catering, and we're doing this in association with the Hospital Caterers Association, the HCA. Hospitals are, as I'm sure you've been well aware, been much in the news over the last 3 months due to the COVID-19 lockdown, and caterers have been playing their part in the tremendous NHS effort that's taken place since. The format for the next hour is pretty straightforward. We'll play an interview with the chair of the HCA, Craig Smith, that we recorded on Monday. And this will be followed by a live Q&A session when Craig and his 4 co-panelists will be available to answer your questions. And perhaps it might be a good opportunity right now to meet his co-panelists. And I'd ask them to introduce themselves. First, we've got Brian Robb.
Morning, I'm Brian Robb. I'm an area facilities manager within NHS Lothian. I look after 5 major hospitals, and I've got about 23 GP practices and medical centres. And on top of that, I'm the honorary vice chair of the Hospital Care Association.
Thank you, Brian. Andy Kemp.
Hello, I'm Andy Kemp. I'm Group Sales and Marketing Director of Bidfood and also sit as Vice Chair of Arena and a couple of industry bodies. Thank you.
Okay, and Gail Walker.
Hi, I'm Gail Walker. I'm Managing Director of Open Door PR and we're food service marketing specialists. I worked recently on the board of the government's hospital food review with Phil and Craig.
Okay, thank you. And finally, Phil Shelley.
Hi, good morning everyone. Facilities Manager at Somerset NHSFT. Currently seconded by NHSI to support the team nationally. Past Chair of the HCA and current Chair of the Food Review. Great to be with you this morning.
Okay, right. If you want to get in touch during the webinar, you've got 2 ways of doing it, and it might be actually worth me mentioning even before I do that, that other than the 4 panelists, Craig and me, everyone else will be muted. But yes, if you want to put a question to the panelists, then we're asking you to use the Q&A function, making sure you include your name and your company. And please try and keep this 2 questions rather than comments or statements. That way we can make the most of the time available to us. You can post a question at any time. There's no need to wait for the end of the video interview. And it's worth mentioning that there is another way you can stay in touch, and that is to use the chat function. And this is more for sort of comments and reaction that you might want to do. You're more than welcome to add those there. If you do, choose the function to all panelists and attendees, and then everyone can see what you're saying. Unfortunately, if you post a question to chat, we won't be able to answer it. We are recording the whole webinar, and a recording of it will be available on the Public Sector Catering website on Monday, so no need to take any notes. I guess the other thing worth mentioning is that if we don't have time to get round to your question or all the questions that are being asked, we do intend to follow up, and we will make sure that there are answers to these, and we'll be posting those online too. Just before we actually start the interview with Craig, I better introduce him just in case there's anyone here who doesn't know him. For more than 40 years, he's had experience working in the NHS, starting off as an assistant catering manager at Lister Hospital in 1979. Became District Catering Advisor for North Hertfordshire Health Authority before joining the fledgling healthcare service provider Mediclean as its first catering manager at the Bristol Royal Infirmary and associated other hospitals. Craig is currently Head of Corporate Affairs at ISS and became National Chair of the Hospital Caterers Association in April 2019. We'll now run the video. Well, hello, Craig. I hope you're keeping well.
I'm fine, thank you. And you?
Yeah, excellent. And we'll kick off with the first question then. As we continue the process of moving out of lockdown, What do you see happening in hospital catering over the next few months?
Okay. One of the first things I want to say from the outset, though, is when everybody's talking about coming out of lockdown, an awful lot of the hospital caterers have been right at the forefront, and when they come out of lockdown, it isn't really too much different for them because they've been in this crisis right from the very start. But what I hope that we'll see is a careful and a measured return to some kind of normality. What that normality looks like just yet, I'm not quite sure. But what we have found is that because of the COVID outbreak, an awful lot of our other services that we provide for other health issues have been curtailed. Cancer, orthopedics, normal surgeries have all been cancelled. So what we'll be seeing is, I hope, a reopening of those wards in a measured way so that we can get back to what we consider to be correct healthcare.
Okay.
On the retail side, though, we need to be seeing the whole of the retail element in hospitals starting to come back to being some kind of normal. But that's with the rest of the retail in the high street in exactly the same way.
Okay. What about if we take just a slightly longer term view of the service, maybe over the next sort of 6 months to a year? Do you see some of those things that you've just mentioned there starting to develop differently perhaps than they were the way they did before?
I think so. I think that we've got to learn from these experiences very much. We've been in at the outset of this, everybody kept saying it's extraordinary times. Well, we've lived through them now, and we've got to learn the lessons that we were given in there. And I think that there will be some things that will change. I mean, one thing that I can immediately point to is the way that everybody so far has addressed the system of cashless sales. I think that it will be a very good idea if more and more of our retail units move to a cashless society. Everybody else seems to be moving that way. It is a lot safer. It's a lot cleaner. But there are other things that we have to start addressing, and things that we've learned throughout this crisis are things like the sandwich deliveries and so forth that we've had. We had the whole thing about listeria before we had COVID. We kind of just climbed out of that pit that we got into, and we've already seen that a major supplier of sandwiches to the NHS has actually gone into liquidation because of this outbreak. So that's two major suppliers that we've lost, and so we've got to start looking for other answers that are more sustainable, but more importantly, probably safe.
Okay. And just taking now a real long view, do you think the lockdown will have a lasting impact on hospital catering service? And if so, can you give us an idea of maybe in what ways we might see that happen?
It's very much in the crystal ball, that really. But what I hope will come out of it is that we will come out as a lot stronger, not only as a catering service, but as the soft facilities completely across the NHS. What we've been able to do in these last few months is to really demonstrate the importance of what our kind of people are actually delivering into the NHS. It's been recognised by the general public, maybe for the first time. We've always known that we've played an important role, but I hope that will not be lost. Yeah. Okay.
You've hinted at some of the things that maybe the lessons learned, if you like, already. I wonder if you sort of perhaps can give us one or two more examples, and then also sort of address the issue of planning for contingencies such as we've been through, whether the plans that you've had have actually worked out in practice.
Okay, well, to address the contingency planning, the NHS has always been very strong on having contingency plans and everything in place, and from time to time they've always been looked at and brushed down. We've had emergency scenarios where everybody is put through their paces to see whether it works or not. But it does take a proper crisis to actually really put these things into the fire and make sure that they work. And I think, from my point of view, certainly from looking across a number of hospitals across the 4 nations, it hasn't been found to be wanting. The caterers have been involved right from the outset in terms of the planning, what had to be delivered, how it was delivered, and we actually got on and did it. And I think, if anything, that's come out of that is a proof positive that our teams are really as integral to the NHS as the nurses and the doctors, and that's a very important message to come through. What we've seen in across the various hospitals are just endless stories of people who have gone that extra mile and have shown exactly why people like myself and the hospital caterers, why we work in hospitals. It is an exceptional element of the hospitality industry, and we really can and do make a difference.
Okay, turning maybe now to the supply chain. How have they supported you over the last 3 months or so?
We have to say the supply chain have been absolutely brilliant. The food suppliers like Bidfood and even some of the smaller suppliers have been absolutely outstanding in making sure that our supply lines were top priority and then got through. But equally, our equipment supplies and everything, they have been outstanding as well. They've been in touch with us throughout. They've been saying, if anything is broken down or needs repairs, we're going to be standing beside you. We're coming in to make sure that things work. And that it's one of my highlights, I think, of this whole crisis, that our supply chain has really stood right beside us, rock solid. Yeah. Okay. Big round of applause for them.
I'm sure they're very grateful for those kind words there. Not everything right now is about COVID-19, I hope anyway. And I just wanted to make the point that the HCA's given its support to the Public Sector Catering 100 groups, 20% less meat campaign. I wanted to know why you think it's important to look at cutting back on red meat in particular in our diets at this time.
Okay, I think the 20% less campaign is important to us across the whole of the public sector industry for a number of reasons. One is that I think that we have to reflect our demographics. We know that something like 1 in 8 of the population are now either vegetarian or vegan, that 1 in 5 of us actually claim to be flexitarians, and that has seen a general reduction in the amount of meat, predominantly red meat, that we're taking. But we also want to use it as an exercise of actually saying, rather than just cutting the amount of meat that we have in the diet, let's have better quality. Let's reinvest in what abilities that we do have to have better quality and probably more British meat. And those kind of things are really important in the campaign too, I believe. Okay.
Well, you mentioned a little bit earlier about how the suppliers in the supply chain have risen to the demands of the occasion. I just wondered what your feeling was about the HCA members themselves and how they've carried themselves during these very challenging times that we've had.
I've got nothing but pride for the various people that I'm hearing about. And obviously, as National Chair of the Hospital Caterers Association, I have the ability to dip in and out of all the different regions around the country and to join in with them and understanding, not only sort of spreading the information that is of use to everybody, which is an important part of any association, but equally to join in the stories that are coming out from people. What we found at the beginning of this crisis is that almost without exception, the hospital caterers, the catering management teams were suddenly working almost flat out, and in some cases like 7 days a week to start off with, to ensure that everything was right from the outset. But then we start hearing about specific people who have really sort of taken this that extra mile, and like having to stay away from home because they don't want to bring any infections back from the hospital back into their home, or equally the other way. And that's a real personal sacrifice that a number of people have made. And I've heard these stories up and down the country of people having to do this. And really, it has been one of these things about our people have been on the front line from day one. You know, we're not only preparing the food down in the kitchens, but also the catering teams go up onto the ward levels, and they're the people who are actually serving the patients at ward level. Now, I accept that most of the COVID patients might not have really strong appetites because of the nature of their illness and so forth, but that doesn't diminish the risk that anybody that works on those wards has to live with 24/7, and I think that that's something that everybody can be remarkably proud of.
Craig, you know as well as anyone that the hospital food review that was carried out late last year is something we've all been waiting to hear about. What are your hopes in the review, and do you have any idea when we might see it?
Okay, well, I'm very sad that it got diverted because of the crisis. Phil Shelley and his team had put in an enormous amount of work to get things to a place where it was virtually, well, I believe that the report is finished and it's just on a shelf waiting for ministerial approval prior to its launch. But of course, you know, we have to wait for the government to do that. I hope that when we have the webinar, Phil Shelley will actually be joining us. He may be able to give us more of a steer on this sort of thing. But I would like to see that at least by the end of before the government go for their summer recess, that we'll be able to share it with everybody.
Okay. Now this can't happen, but let's just suppose for a moment that we could magic you into the next cabinet meeting at Downing Street. If you were there, what would be the one thing you'd ask the government to do that would help hospital catering?
Okay, well, as we went through the hospital food review, Phil and the team, we visited as many different types of hospital as we could. And what we did was we deliberately wanted to go and see mental health units, care in the community units, as well as just the straightforward acute units. And if you'd asked me at the outset of the food review, and indeed at the back of the notebook that I had for the review, I wrote down a number of things that I wanted to achieve from the outset. And probably the biggest headline at that time was that I wanted to ensure that the government ring-fence the actual spend that we have on food so that it couldn't be subject to any cost reduction programs and things like that. That really was my biggest hope that we would get out of it. But you know what? As we went around looking at the different places, a lot of people weren't as concerned about the money that they have for their cost per patient day. Obviously, some were very low and some were extremely high, and we need to address that, and I don't dismiss it. But the thing that came through really loud and clear is that if I had one thing to ask the government, it would be, please, please, can we have some significant investment into our equipment and the infrastructure of our catering departments? Some of the catering departments that we went to see, whilst the catering teams were full of enthusiasm and wanted to do everything possible for their patients, the environment in which they were working on simply hasn't changed for, well, I hate to say it, maybe 30 years or more. And that is desperately sad. We do need some serious investment in these areas.
Okay. Yeah, I wanted to take a look at plate waste as an issue now, because I know the HCA's spent quite a lot of time focusing on it in recent years, and the reason's clear, is that it is a major contributor to the carbon footprint of catering. So given the need to cut emissions, what should the service be doing to tackle the problem?
I think the issue itself is wider than just plate waste, but obviously plate waste plays a significant part in it. We know that some trusts get rid of their plate waste simply down through the waste disposal unit, so they don't consider it to have any cost, whilst other trusts can be charged up to £175 a tonne is not unreasonable in some areas just to cart this stuff away. So we do need to be looking at it. One of the things that perhaps might come out of the coronavirus issues and everything else is because of the need to be sure that we got everything right, a lot of people actually reduced their menus quite significantly throughout this process, and the level of choice was severely curtailed. And that was curtailed because of good reasons that we weren't sure of the getting the supply in, or one reason or another. But we've survived. And do we need, on a, let's say, a 28, 30 bedded ward, do we need to have significant choice right to the last patient each and every time? And I know most people will say, well, yes, of course we do. But if we do that, we have to recognise that there's a huge amount of waste there. So we have to be looking at more innovative things about how we can capture those requests before it actually gets up to the ward level. And I know that the Hospital Caterers Association, we were looking at another waste programme to be issued, and we were looking for that to be issued almost in line with the Hospital Food Review. And of course then we have the Food Standards and Strategy groups, which are working alongside the review group, which will then publish after the main review is done. So there's plenty of things that we can be talking about there. But equally on the other side of reducing waste and our carbon footprint, I think the NHS is probably almost at the forefront of looking at alternative waste than single-use plastics, both in our packaging and in terms of our disposable cutlery and all the other pots and things that we use for our retail units. I think that will actually start to bring down a lot of our carbon footprint too. Okay.
Moving on to another issue now, which the HCA has to sort of face up to. That's outsourcing. I just wondered if you thought that we might see more outsourced meal service provision as a result of the coronavirus.
It's an interesting question, and of course, I have to declare my own interest of working for an outsourced company. But do we, or do I personally foresee an increase in its usage? I'm not entirely sure that we will. It depends. It depends whether or not the government listens to my single request of giving us more investment into the catering departments. A lot of catering departments are having to look very seriously about having a brought-in solution, because the premises that they're working on are no longer fit for purpose, and that's something that needs to be addressed. But I don't want to give anything away from the Hospital Food Review, but these kind of questions about the delivered meal service against conventional has really been tested quite strongly in the review, and I think it's fair to say that opinions changed during the actual process of pulling the review together, and that was clearly based upon actually people looking at the actual service in front of the patient. And it's really the food being put in front of the patient is the important thing here.
Okay. Now the HCA talks, and you all know this better than most, about the power of three. In other words, clinicians, dietitians and caterers working together for the benefit of the patient. I've just wondered whether what's happened over the last few months in care homes in particular might mean now that we need to include social carers into the equation and perhaps make it a power of four. I just wondered then, what do you think could be done to better integrate social care into the health service?
If I could just deal with the Power of Three first. The Power of Three was a campaign which was really directed very much at ward level, and it is very important that everybody works together from the ward door to the patient's bedside, and that's where the Power of Three came from, and it still remains an extremely important element of what we're doing. But you're quite right. The social element, the social care element, is something that has been raised really sort of quite rightly in the media's attention. And we do. I mean, the NACC is a sister association who works very hard to represent the people from the care community. But I know from personal experience, I'm a member of the Oxford branch of the Hospital Caterers Association, and we welcome a number of people to our branch meetings who come from the care community, and there are important lessons which both of us can learn from each other. So I certainly think that the social care sector is an integral part of public sector catering. Yeah.
Okay. Right. That was all the questions that I had, Craig. Much there for our panel and audience to consider now. Thank you.
Thank you.
Right, we're back live now, and before we take the first question, perhaps I'll invite our panelists just to offer their initial thoughts on what they've heard. Brian, how about you?
Yeah, I think some of what Craig was saying was really, really good. I would think that the support that we've had recently from our suppliers has been second to none. Our local procurement departments and our national procurement departments have been doing a fantastic job where we've had any shortages at all, and it's not all been on food. I would have to say they've been trying to outsource alternative supplies. So, there have been some difficulties, but from a food perspective, we've had hardly any. The food chain has kept moving. It's been excellent. Crisis management, we touched on that briefly. It's something that we do as caterers anyway, every day in life. So a lot of caterers are used to working in environments that are quite volatile in some areas, especially from staffing perspectives. But from what I'm hearing around Scotland, it has been particularly well managed. Interested to hear if Phil can give us any more information on the food review. Everybody's been waiting on that coming out.
I'm sure we'll have a few questions.
Yeah, obviously the government are they've got a lot of things on their plate right now.
Yeah.
I mean, if it's ready to go to print, then hopefully that'll be happening quite soon. But yeah, a lot of what Craig was saying, I would totally back up.
Excellent, Andy, your thoughts?
Well, I think it's a couple of thoughts really. I suppose on with regard to food supply, the one thing I can say is that there wouldn't have been a wholesaler within the UK that would have a problem of having stock in their warehouses when everything stopped. We all had food, and on the areas of the fresh products that we were distributing, we made a very conscious decision that we would prioritise NHS care homes and those elements within our society that we deemed as being vulnerable, including people within prisons, etc., that had no choice of having food coming from any one area. I do believe we're going to go through a major area of change, particularly in this sector. There's no question of a doubt about that. I think that the COVID endemic has really made us sit up and think about what crisis management is all about. I have to say, as an individual, I have been very disappointed in the lack of recognition for our frontline caterers, who have been equally as exposed as many of the support teams within the NHS and our nursing homes, and have done a terrific job. And I think that it's been undervalued and underplayed a lot, both in the press and around the marketplace. Unless you're working within the NHS, and certainly my wife has a medical background, and certainly she's very conscious of the importance of the support by the caterers within particularly the NHS, and feeding those staff who are often working 18, 19 hours a day. With regard to outsourcing, I do believe again that the government will start to think very seriously about the provision of services within the NHS, and also with the provision of sub-services of those elements around it that support all care of the nation, including nursing homes. So there will be a change there. Whether it'll drive more outsourcing, I don't know. I would suspect that it'll drive a higher compliance of standard and an expectation that an organisation can be accountable for the services they're offering. Thank you.
Okay. Gail, the point that Andy made there about the recognition of the role that caterers play, what do you think might be a sort of one way of helping to sort of raise that profile and get that recognition?
I think it was a great point, although I would counter it with the fact that YouGov have put out some information saying that actually recognition for caterers, hospitality, delivery drivers, these people now essentially are minimum wage to frontline people. I think there's actually been, their recognition of them is higher than ever. You know, we've had claps for NHS staff, but we've equally had people paying for people's food, delivery drivers having big thank yous, and people putting up posters in their windows. So I think actually in the broader sense, there is recognition of the work that people do, and they recognise that when everybody else sat at home watching Netflix, these people were out there working, and we needed them to work, and they were quite amazing. So I come to that slightly. I think there is recognition for it, and I think that as we come out of lockdown, our job now as communicators is really to keep that pressure up, and to use this opportunity now to really escalate that and keep that status really high with the general population, but also with caterers within their own organisations, really engaging with stakeholders, chief executives, and making sure that this message that food is part of the medicine is out there, and that it's funded.
Okay, thank you. Phil?
Yeah, I must say, I thought it was a superb overview from Craig. I thought he managed to cover a dozen topics amazingly, so well done, both of you, for doing that. I think what Craig has told us is where we are now, and it is a different situation to anything probably any of us have ever faced. But I think what he picked up on is where we need to be, and he's just started to plant a few seeds on where we could go. And of course, most importantly, is how we can do it. Of course, part of the review's task will be to do that. But we've also got things like the food standards that will be coming out shortly after that. And we've also got some great work that's going on throughout the association anyway. So what we mustn't forget is all the different streams that are going on to help things move forward. What I am very wary of is that we are waiting for something, and I always say to people, on our visits, we haven't just spoken to managers, we've spoken to every type of role, and every role we've spoken to, they're all leaders. They're all people that actually drive change. And I think it's important for us to recognise that, leaders have got a desire to make a change, and it's, most of the time Fresh fortunately is positive. Some of the areas that we went to, you could just see they were burning for us to be there, for them to share what they're doing, and for how they can help us going forward. And before we go into anything, I just want to say, I mean, both Gail and Craig were on the review panel, and I have to say, on behalf of the HCA, they represented the association absolutely brilliantly. Their commitment was faultless, and I can't thank them enough.
Okay, thank you. Right, well, as the point of the exercise today is, as well as sort of giving ourselves a chance to look back at what's happened, is to see what has happened and how that might affect what happens in the future. We've got a question from a lady called Gladys Yunusa from Bournemouth, and she's wondering about some of the barriers to meal times and meal preparation that have been overcome over the last 3 months and have made a difference, and how we can sort of draw lessons from where these challenges have been overcome and use them in the future. Brian, do you have any thoughts on that?
I think it has been a huge challenge, especially where we've had COVID patients within wards. Some of our sites, we're moving into the 21st century. We've got single occupancy rooms. That was the way that they decided to move, and that in itself brings challenges. You might have a ward with 22 single rooms, and every patient's got to be fed, and at some point somebody's got on and off, go into that room to feed them a meal or give them a meal. That has been a huge challenge. It's delayed service at ward level, and in particular where we might have had, especially in some of the new builds, single room occupancy, but they've perhaps created a separate area for everybody to sit and socially integrating. So the food service end is away from the rooms, and we're not geared up. We maybe don't have the proper trolley service. If it's a bulk service, it's delayed further. It's brought up quite a number of challenges actually, and certainly in my own areas, we're starting to now review the types of equipment that we've got, the staffing levels, because whereby there's maybe an expectancy that falls on facility staff, and previously it's sitting with nursing colleagues. It's when they're having their breaks during meal times. It's been quite a challenge, and it's an interesting one, and there's a lot of lessons to be learned. Certainly that's within my area. I'm sure others will have various degrees of similarity.
Okay, thank you. We've got a couple of sort of nuts and bolts style questions now. Helen Westwood from the Sheffield Teaching Hospital, and she's also the HCA branch secretary for the Trent region. She's looking for recommendations for any particular style of mask to wear that's suitable for food safe environments. Craig, maybe you could just help us out there. Is there any sort of recommendations on this?
Okay, I think that the safest way, because I'm not an expert on this and I have to hold my hand up to it, but the safest way is that we, as an association, that should be acting as the conduit to get out the advice from the four nations health boards like NHS England, NHS Scotland and so forth. We have been working very closely in making sure that as many of our people as need them are getting the proper PPE, but I'm not aware of anything which is specific to the food service. But what I am have been reminded of very recently, and Brian has been talking about this as well, this in a central production unit at the moment, it is an extremely high risk area for the delivery of service, because if somebody with this track and trace is being told to go and self-isolate because they've been in contact with somebody, that could affect an entire catering department, and the complete service could be locked down. So it's something that we need to be taking extremely seriously. But I would come back to the advice from NHS England, NHS Improvement is based upon the science, and so that's where we should leave it.
Okay, thank you. And there was another one here. Yeah, someone asking about whether the HCA is going to issue any guidance for retail outlets within hospitals on what could be sold. They say it seems a bit confusing. Should people be allowed, as it says, sandwiches, should we serve them or let customers choose them, for instance, is one of the sort of the dilemmas they face. Phil?
Yes. Well, yeah, I think it's very difficult for us to start to dictate what retail will sell. Well, I just want to pick up on some of those challenges. And of course, as caterers in the hospital sector, a lot of our retail almost shut down as soon as COVID was upon us. There were major staffing issues with our outlets, and therefore they shut down because, one, they weren't prepared, like all of us, for the circumstances. There were major staffing issues. So to help get things back on track, we've had to look at obviously our screening and our separation and our masks, and we use the FFP2s through NHSI, and it generally works. What I would say is that the relationships that we want hospitals to have with their retail sectors in healthcare is very, very important. And for me personally, we've tried to have a solid foundation. So whether you're commercial or you're private or you're public sector, you're all working together, you're all serving the same people, and therefore you try and find the best solutions. Our exec and our boards expect us to lead on the key topics that we're responsible for. And it's been fascinating. I've never seen so many men wash their hands before. This COVID has really refreshed us about safety and about hygiene. And again, I think Brian picked it up earlier. We're in a new situation now. We need to make the most of this remit about safety and the way we care for ourselves and the way we hand on that accountability by sharing space with each other. So, I mean, some of the suppliers, no doubt, that have linked in today, how they have managed to continue their food production, it must have been an absolute challenge, because in our own kitchens, we've had to segregate, we've had to stagger meal breaks and just work very differently. And you're right, going forward, it is going to be different.
Okay, thank you. Andy, the suppliers, I think, were all geared up for the pandemic to bring in many more people into hospitals, maybe than turned out to be the case. I think people would be interested to know, first of all, what it's done to the supply chain and how you see going forward the gradual opening up of the way that hospitals work affecting supplies.
Well, first of all, with regard to the amount of people coming into hospital, we were very, very clear, having had lots of meetings, that particularly with the Nightingales, that as we started to open up, the requirement for food will be much more around dysphasic food rather than traditional hospital service. That was the first thing. And the second thing was that we were rapidly losing volumes, as the caterers were, as COVID patients were taking over the hospitals, and therefore the requirement of food started to shrink. So with regard to maintaining the volumes going forward, it wasn't too bad, in fairness. I mean, that was quite easy. I think the difference that we started to see was that lots of major manufacturers physically shut down, even some of the biggest ones. So therefore, depending on the kind of service that you had, would depend on what you could get. I mean, a great example would be someone like Coke, who are a terrific supplier into hospitality. They use an awful lot of post-mix in places like Kentucky Fried, Burger King, McDonald's, and so on and so forth. And immediately the supply volume plus the pubs stopped. So as a consequence, they stopped production of post-mix. So therefore, those caterers that were using a post-mix to service carbonated drinks suddenly found they weren't available because no one was manufacturing them in the volumes that we went through. The second and most difficult area for us was the immediate panic within the retail sector. And of course, the majority of our suppliers trade into both retail and into food service. And they immediately switched their production over to the retail to meet the demands of the major supermarkets. And so we were then in a scramble to try and get a like product. So what we were then doing was offering an immediate alternative in simple elements. For example, if Heinz baked beans weren't available, we were offering Cross and Blackwell. So this kind of gave many caterers additional work as they were then working on the nutritional standards of their menus and looking at the ingredient of the alternative that was being offered. But this only ran for a short period of time. In the main, supply worked well. British suppliers were superb, particularly the fruit and veg suppliers, who really did turn on and turn around very quickly. I know many of them were working virtually 24/7. Even though they were experiencing very, very high levels of waste, they were still giving us full service across the ranges we were offering. The hardest element, I would say, was sitting within those clients that were buying PPE, where we would stock that as well as specialist operators. And as we were buying out of places like China, who were still producing the major volumes, they were literally talking to major operators like ourselves and putting us into a bidding war. So we may have 5 containers on order. We would get a phone call from them saying, well, actually, a German wholesaler has just offered 20% more. If you will pay 20% more, we will ship you. If not, you'll have to go back to the back of the list. And we found that uncomfortable and not particularly good. That was the negative. The positive is we operate a business out of China as well. So we just got our Chinese division to buy the product and then they shipped it out to us. So therefore, it managed to keep our supply going. I do want to answer the question on face masks because we have the benefit of having businesses across the world. And this area has been brought forward. And I also had a note from Andy Jones with regard to this. And the effect of face masks in a kitchen environment, particularly the effect that humidity has on it and how long it will last. And I don't believe that we can get material that will take away that humidity and the effect of that face mask being as effective as possible. And I think the only thing we're going to start to move towards, or should move towards, will be the frequency of change. So therefore, I'm certain that when people dig into this with greater knowledge, where there may be a recommendation to change the product every 4 hours, I think what we'll start to see for the caterer, specifically in the kitchen environment, is to reduce this 4 hours to 2 or less. I don't believe that we will see different products being produced to enable us to use that. Thank you.
Okay, thank you. Gail, picking up on the point that you actually made about perhaps the need to start cranking up the PR now that the sort of the first wave, if you like, of panic seems to have died down a little bit. I mean, a couple of people have come in with questions on this, talking about sharing the good news and thanking our teams publicly, and someone else making the point that it would be nice to do this beyond just saying they're everyday heroes. What do we do to raise their importance and value?
I think the first thing to say is that during a crisis, and certainly a global pandemic is definitely categorized as one of those, the first thing you do is you have to stop communicating, you have to stop advertising, and you have to look at what you're saying. Is it tone deaf in the current environment? And in fact, many of the campaigns would have been. So it's really important to stop that, to make sure that you're not seen to be capitalising or actually capitalising on a tragedy, or not reflecting the right situation. As we've come through lockdown and starting to emerge now's a really good time to actually start messaging internally within the organisations and within hospitality, but also further than that. So, for example, if you look at the NHS as a brand, it has never, ever had such high status. The goodwill that it has achieved in this period is you couldn't purchase this. The loyalty, the engagement, the ownership. So we call that brand equity. And if you look at people talking, they're saying things like our NHS, we own the NHS. And that is a really good opportunity for caterers and suppliers now to do some real good. So from the caterer side of things, I think there's an opportunity to take that goodwill and take it to their chief execs, take it to the government, take it to their trust and say, and we need to be funded. It's also a good opportunity to raise their own status within their trust and again promote the fact that food is medicine and it's critical. On the supplier front, we've got brands knocking on our door saying, how do we connect with the NHS? How much will it cost? We want to do this. So all the suppliers out there, you've already been working with the NHS, you have that equity. And now's the time to start communicating, partners with the NHS for 25 years. We've supplied the NHS for 20 years. We're here. We're still in business. We're proud to be part of the NHS. And there's a really good narrative that can come out of this lockdown. And it couldn't have happened earlier. We have to do things in the right time and the right space. And I think what Andy was saying there, and Phil, there's a good opportunity. I think, your restaurants, or not your restaurants, but your services have been open. So I think something we might look to do, Craig, is to actually case study that and help share with the rest of hospitality how you've operated. I think they'd be interested to see how social distancing has or hasn't worked, and what things they can take from that.
Okay, thank you. Phil, I'm going to have to come back to you on the food review. A number of people asking when we might see it and any insight at all that you can supply about what we might see in it. Is there anything you can help us with on that?
Yeah, of course. I mean, the timing was cruel. There's no doubt about it. But when you bear in mind the situation, it was the right thing to do. Delay it to ensure that we have an impact at the right time, and so therefore the report needs to be suitable. And picking up on what Gail says right now is at the time we were waiting for the report and the political and the public support was there. However, I think it's there in greater strength now. So it is important that we get a launch. First of all, we decide on how we're going to implement it, and I firmly believe there will be a 2-year implementation plan, so we can work with associations and our colleagues to actually help make the right decisions. We need funding, there's no doubt about it. What I don't want to do is say it's all about the money, because I don't believe it is. I think a lot of it is about the way we work in our establishments, but also with each other. We were so fortunate to see amazing hospital visits where, people were proud of what they do. And it's important that we're able to buddy up and learn from each other. So there needs to be a balanced view. And I think what is likely that will happen, that the timing will be in a way that it will link to a spending review. So it's important that we can link into that and help the politicians realise, we need the money. This is what we need it for right now. But also over a 2-year period, we need a continual spend. And that not only helps the caterers, but it helps our suppliers, whether your food or your equipment. If when do I go and talk to caterers and procurers, and what do I talk to them about? Don't waste your time going to talk about something that is inappropriate. You want to know the topics that we're going to lead on, and therefore you can come in and open the doors and be there at the right time. So, yeah, it's difficult for me to say exactly when. I think it's highly unlikely now that it will be pre-summer. I think it will be very quickly after the summer, because that links into the October-November spending review. But it will be down to the Secretary of State. The report, although finished, we're having to work extremely hard and long nights to adapt it because of COVID. The report was written pre-COVID, but we cannot ignore what has happened. And we have to take that into consideration and learn from it. So we adapt it in a way that people can pick it up and know that it's fresh.
Okay, that's brilliant. Brian, I wanted to turn to you now. We've had several questions in, people asking, for instance, that the experience of reduced choice menus that have had to be instituted over the last 3 months, and someone else was made a point about the preference of service systems, perhaps a preference for plating meals as opposed to bulk serving on wards. Do you see things like that changing the way that hospital catering operates as we sort of move out of our sort of the first 3 months of the COVID-19 pandemic?
Menu reduction hasn't happened everywhere, I would have to say. Menu reductions have probably been something that was maybe implemented right at the very beginning, where they thought there were going to be food shortages. Certainly, with my experience, is we looked at it, and we considered menu reduction. One of the things that probably stopped us from doing it straight away was the background work that was going to be required by dietitians to make sure that we were going to meet nutritional needs of our clients, and how we were going to do that if we reduced the menu choice, and would the overall nutritional needs be sufficient. We did consider, obviously, that, as Andy had said, that the increase in public that was going to happen for COVID. We did see that happening in some of our hospital sites. In terms of food service and what's delivered to the patient, there's a lot of places do need, as Craig's picked up and Phil's already said, investment in catering departments and in food service delivery models is something that's really overdue. We've still got some hospital sites, and it's sad to say it, operating systems that were late 70s, early 80s, ambient trolleys serving hot food. The lack of investment is apparent, but now when you start to look at trying to get the money to do that, governments are telling you they've not got the money. So, as Phil was alluding to, we're starting to look now at a long-term plan. We've got 3, 5, 7-year plans now in place, and what we can do and what we're going to prioritise as replacing our food service models. And that was actually brought about because of part of the food review, part of what happened down in England in relation to listeria. Because in Scotland, many of us did go away and we reviewed our cold chain. We then looked at our hot chain as well. But the cold chain was the first thing. So we know where our areas are. We know the areas that require investment. It's getting that money. And it's made a priority. So sometimes it's those that scream loudest get it. The other thing that we're currently doing within Scotland is we're also reviewing production units because of lack of investment. We're currently modelling up what we would look like if we had maybe 3 or 4 central production units across the whole of Scotland to deliver a cook freeze model. Now that in itself brings with it a lot of angst within caterers. But we have got areas within Glasgow that have got 2 freeze models. When you do that kind of modelling, you're then looking at the service delivery at ward automatically has to change because you need to look at regeneration type trolley systems. So I think there's still a wee bit off yet. There is no magic wand. Money is going to be at the forefront at any time.
Brian, I'm sorry, but we're sort of reaching the end of our hour now, and I probably need to start wrapping things up. But I wanted to say thank you, everyone, today for taking part. Craig, Phil, Brian, Gail, and Andy. We have to remind you now that there will be a link to the full recording of this webinar available on Monday from the Public Sector Catering website. The next one of our The Future of Your Food Service webinars takes place on July the 2nd, when Matthew White, Chair of TUCO, will join us to look at higher education.